Welcome to Back to the Texts Themselves, a series on phenomenology. Today's video covers sections 45 to 58 of Husserl's Cartesian Meditations. In the previous video, we considered a move from the transcendental ego to the ego reduced to its primordial sphere of ownness. All contributions to experience that require the other, another ego, were artificially bracketed from consideration so that we could more precisely take up what my ego uniquely contributes to my lived experience. From this move, we arrived at the lived body, a psychophysical unity that forms the fundamental basis for all other experience. Such a move was an abstraction from the transcendental ego, since the contribution of others are inextricable to this domain. However, it allows us to clarify more precisely the unique contribution made by that which is outside of me and to explicate the manner by which this is possible. For this video, we'll first further elaborate upon this primordial world of the psychophysical ego, specifying some of its positive characteristics. 2, take up the transcendental problem of intersubjectivity, namely how it is possible, in beginning from my primordial world, to distinguish and come into contact with others. And 3, consider how transcendental intersubjectivity forms the basis for the objective world and cultural world. If you watched the previous video, you might recall that to reach the transcendental ego, we bracketed the objective real world. In turn, the transcendental ego constitutes itself as a psychophysical ego by bracketing all that is alien to its sphere of ownness. By bracketing all otherness, we arrive at the reduced human ego that, as a radical immanent sphere of ownness, is given as my psyche. Thus, Husserl's concept of the transcendental ego reveals a kind of internal division within it. This idea of a split subject seemingly challenges our preconceived notions of the ego in Husserl's philosophy. Nonetheless, the division comes as no surprise if we remember that Husserl has already acknowledged the importance of intersubjectivity in the constitution of the objective world within transcendental experience. Husserl argues that we have only identified the psychophysical ego's negative characteristics, that it excludes anything that is different from it, any alter ego. Yet there are also positive characteristics. How do we go about describing them? Well, Husserl illustrates this point with a concrete object. Initially, the object appears to us as an undetermined intuition. To arrive at a determined object, one we recognize as a particular object with specific traits, we must explicate what is already implicitly present in the object, which reveals its internal determinations that belong to its sphere of ownness. In essence, the process of explicating does not entail imposing attributes onto the object, but uncovering what was already there waiting to be discovered. The ego undergoes a similar two-step process. First, through a grasping perception, the ego discovers itself in an original self-experience, an intuition, including its infinite horizon of undiscovered internal determinations that are constitutive of its sphere of ownness. Second, the experiencing, explicating gaze of the transcendental ego unfolds these determinations, resulting in the discovery of positive characteristics, which, as Husserl discusses here, includes things like its immanent temporality, its existence as an open and infinite stream of subjective processes, and even its very act of self-explication that it's engaging in to unfold these determinations. Husserl's concept of the psychophysical ego also intrinsically includes intentional and transcendental objects. Now, this seems to contradict what we've already said about the necessary contribution of intersubjectivity in the constitution of objectivities. However, such objects only belong to my sphere of ownness to the degree that they're limited to their pure sensuousness and immanent temporality. So essentially, all objectivities presuppose intersubjectivity. But Husserl's important restriction sheds light on the nature of intentional and transcendental objects as they appear within the psychophysical ego sphere of ownness. Now, though Husserl doesn't put it in these terms, later phenomenologists will talk about affectivity and the sensibility of the body as the primordial domain by which all objects first enter the stream of lived experience prior to being constituted as something truly objective and thus truly intersubjective. Section 48 marks a shift from this primordial world of the psychophysical ego to a sense of an existence that lies beyond it. Husserl reminds us of the dividedness of transcendental consciousness between self-directed and other-directed modes, and he asks how other-directed intentionalities can be distinguished from the self-directed ones, and how the experience of the truly alien is possible. Husserl's notion of the first other is critical for understanding how the objective world emerges from the primordial world. While he doesn't delve into this concept of the first other in any depth here, it's plausible that the first other, if it has any concrete representative in the life of the ego, might be considered something like the child's primary caregiver, as the child has no access to an objective world and must rely on a primary relation to open up this possibility. The first other is the one who enables an infinite domain of otherness that encompasses other egos and the objective world. And again, it's unclear from the text whether this notion of a first other is a purely theoretical and logical necessity only, or if it can always be traced back to an empirical fact as well. Husserl then outlines how we can experience what lies beyond our primordial sphere. In essence, he asks, what enables us to make the other present even though it's not originally a part of our own experience? Now he says here, experience includes both perception and apperception. While perception involves directly sensing the part of an object facing us, apperception refers to our indirect awareness of the object's features that are not immediately perceived. This complete apperceptive experience allows us to recognize the object as a whole. And when it comes to a three-dimensional object, it can be verified by physically exploring the object, confirming our apperception within perception through a fulfilling intuition. When it comes to experiencing others, however, we actually can't verify their sphere of ownness in the same manner. So how then do we experience them as other? How is this experience verified? Husserl suggests that we first perceive the other as a distant body, a body over there, which we then recognize as an animate organism through its movement in space. Our body can move and modify its position freely while always existing in a fixed here wherever we go. We perceive the bodies of others as always being over there. Yet through some imaginal variation of ourselves in their position, we can gain insight into their experience of space. It's this associative comparison and contrast that allows for the other to be apperceived in their otherness through the givenness of their bodies and movements. The association between my body and the other's body allows for an apperceptive transfer of our animate organism here onto the body of the other over there, enabling us then to analogically experience the other, although like the unseen back of an object, it's not originally given an experience, and unlike the object, we can never go ahead and verify it in actuality. So this act involves an original pairing association between egos, where the two sources of intuition become a unity of consciousness based on a similarity that overlaps each intuition. Husserl uses a helpful analogy to explain this phenomenon, drawing on the way we experienced our past. He suggests that our past, phenomenologically speaking, is always remembered and emerges within present consciousness as a modification of it. This modified present by our past transcends our present experience in some sense, and this present experience of the past is then verified through a series of consistent recollections that harmoniously give themselves in my present. This is the way in which we come to apprehend our past through a phenomenological approach. And a similar logic is at play in the case of the other. the other gives itself as a body over there within my immanent sphere of ownness. Yet the animate body also appresentatively indicates something else, a psyche. When the body gives itself over to me, there's a modification of my primordial world, my ego, which through a contrastive pairing gives rise to an experience that, though primordially unfulfillable, consistently verifies the other. These peculiar modifications or accommodations I have to undergo in encountering the animate body, then, are not ones I do not have to undergo when I'm dealing with an inanimate object. As I repeatedly encounter this animate body, I obtain a kind of continuous and consistent evidence of this modification given in the harmoniousness of the other's behavior. In other words, the otherness, the alien sphere of ownness properly belonging to the other ego, obtains its experiential verification within my own lived experience in its changing but harmonious behavior as manifested through this animated body that I actually perceive. It's the resemblance between the movements of the other and our own that creates an association. At the same time, the spatial difference and lack of psychosomatic unity between the body over there and my own self-experiencing movements necessitates a modification of my perception to accommodate this foreignness. These comparative and contrastive associations thus enable the appercepted transfer of otherness onto this animate body over there. As these apprehensions build up, I begin to apperceive not just the existence sense of the other, that indeed there is another sphere of otherness out there, but through the intentional act of empathy, I can even come to apperceive the contents of that sphere from their outward conduct. Thus, I apperceive the other as happy or sad, pensive or carefree, etc. Such a transfer is not a conscious act of reproduction, comparison, or inference, but rather an intuitive, instantaneous transfer and passive synthesis based in a spontaneous association between my body and the others. Husserl uses the child's encounter with a pair of scissors as an example to illustrate his point. Initially, the child's perception of scissors is formed over time through a series of experiences, culminating in a final glance that provides a complete constitution of the object. And then, upon encountering a new pair of scissors, the child's perception immediately references its prior experience with a similar object, enabling that child to grasp it now at first sight rather than at last sight. This process of passive object formation is akin to how we come to automatically experience others as actually existing outside of myself, wherein we build up a series of experiences that undergo continuous verification that facilitates a synthesizing unity of my experience of the other that in turn allows for an immediate apprehension of every new other I encounter. Later phenomenologists will dispute this possibility of ever obtaining such a final glance for some phenomena. Though it makes sense to arrive at such a glance when it comes to simple objects, some phenomena don't seem to lend themselves to such a moment. For instance, a great painting never fully gets constituted because it always gives more than what could ever be fully apprehended in a single glance or even an infinite number of glances in some cases. The same might be said of other non-object phenomena, such as events, or, in contrast to Husserl here, the face of the other. In the first and most basic communalization, my psychophysical existence is paired with the psychophysical existence of the other as it is constituted in me. Through a continuous confirmation of this phenomenon, I am, as Husserl words it, compelled to say the other exists. At this point, we can begin now to consider a second form of communalization that through a mutual being for one another makes possible the constitution of a shared objective world. A community of egos forms, wherein there is this transcendental intersubjectivity, or what's also called here a we sphere. This sphere generates a communalized intentionality which constitutes the world shared by this ego community. And this is what we call the objective world. Although each ego uniquely experiences this shared world through its own appearance system, these systems are identified as the same across different egos. thereby creating the possibility for a shared experience of the world. By appearance system, I think Husserl means a set of invariant characteristics, probably largely defined in terms of the noetic-noematic correlation, that are responsible for the constitution of objects and lived experience. At the same time, the experience is instantiated within the primordial world of each individual ego. This raises a crucial question. Are there situations in which one does not share the same appearance system with others? Husserl acknowledges such in the text, saying, "Now we know very well that there are such things as abnormalities, for example, in the case of subjects who are blind or deaf. We know that therefore the appearance systems are by no means always absolutely identical, and that whole strata, though not all strata, can differ." He adds to this the difference with non-human animals, which are essentially constituted for me as abnormal variants of my humanness. Thus, these deviations are identified and made possible only on the basis of an intrinsically antecedent normality. Husserl's notion of normality seems to be specific and relative to one's own world and appearance system, however. What is considered normal and abnormal is determined by the associative pairing of one's world and appearance system with that of the other. According to Husserl, humans perceive animals as abnormal variants relative to their own humanness, despite animals having their own sense of normality and abnormality relative to their point of reference. It's unclear, however, whether this relativized normality extends to those who are blind or deaf, the examples that he provides. As their appearance system deviates from the normative vantage point of others, however, it's conceivable that Husserl would maintain that the notion of humanness constituted across such individuals entails its own inherent norms that are not relative within the members of the same category, so human. Now, recognizing the one shared world has two important implications. First, I become aware that I am an other to other people, just as they are to me. This mutual being for one another is critical in understanding our interconnectedness. Second, I realize that other individuals are other to my own other, as they are to me. This open plurality of subjects, forming a possible community of egos, is constituted within my immanent primordial sphere of ownness, which I also apprehend as being constituted for others within their primordial sphere of ownness, though once again with a different subjective mode of appearance for each particular subject. This is not some contingent empirical finding, but rather Husserl seems to think that he's uncovered a basic fundamental dimension of transcendental life, which now allows us to characterize that life in terms of a transcendental intersubjectivity. Once these intersubjective communities constitute an objective world, this objective world can then be fashioned into a cultural world filled with what Husserl calls spiritual objectivities. A cultural world is a world imbued with human significance. But unlike the objective world, which is the same for all, the cultural world is not universally accessible. Various concrete life worlds exist, and not everyone can access each one. While my cultural world exists within my immanent sphere and may be present in others, alien cultures require some kind of empathic intentionality to understand them. And so to broaden our understanding of these cultures, we have to, Husserl says, project ourselves into them and develop a broader sympathetic understanding. Now, notably, it would seem that Husserl will pick up on this theme in his later works, placing the notion of the life world more centrally in his philosophical approach. And this is evidenced in particular by that work that was left unfinished at the time of his death, entitled The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology. If you found this video helpful and it's within your means, please consider making a super thank you tip. You can find the super thank you button below this video. If you wish to be an ongoing supporter of this channel, you can do so on Patreon, where I offer video transcripts and unedited materials. The link is below. I want to thank the following for already supporting this channel on Patreon. You can also support this work by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. So we're now arriving at the end. We have one more video left, and the one after that will be our first video on Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness. And as always, thank you for watching. Until next time, be well.